The number of smartphone users worldwide is estimated at over 5 billion and growing. Almost everybody has a smartphone, and the vast majority of us use it every day, often for many hours without even realizing that we are in the digital space for such a long time. Very often, we basically just scroll through social media with no apparent purpose and no apparent goal. And I get it. This kind of consumption is easy and it's accessible. It's basically just one click away. And it's also effective, right? Each post that we read and each video that we watch is essentially a new topic, a new stimulant for our brain. But the problem with this is that afterwards we very often feel extremely dissatisfied, not just because we've spent so much time doing something that we can now hardly remember, but because this kind of brain-dead consumption has real effects on our mental and physical health. In fact, researchers showed that this kind of mindless consumption has effects on our sleep quality. It makes us more anxious and stressed, and it also makes us less social. But why am I telling you this, and why specifically me? I'm a cognitive scientist at Heidelberg University and the Social Sciences Institute called GESIS. And apart from this, I'm leading several research projects with digital apps, and I'm also the science director and the NPO Pro-Social Design Network. And in all of these positions, my number one goal is to find ways for us to be more at peace with our digital consumption. And so for the last years, I've spent a lot of time thinking about what it is about our digital consumption that makes it so unhealthy and so dissatisfying for us. And I've also thought about ways how we can combat these negative effects. Because I think one thing is clear, and that's that the digital space, the internet, is not going away. And frankly, it shouldn't, right? The digital space has so many opportunities, it has so much to offer, that to some extent we have to understand how to use it properly. Now, at the very beginning of my talk, I just pointed briefly to studies on digital consumption, and some of these studies have quite damning results, to be frank. This perspective of digital consumption being generally bad has really taken hold of our public opinion also. So much so that whenever digital consumption is discussed in the media or at some expert panel, the number one question that's often asked is, how can we effectively reduce our digital consumption? And I think this narrative presents digital consumption to us as a trade-off. I have to pay a certain price with my mental health, with my sleep quality, in order to be able to consume, to reap the benefits of being in the digital space. This narrative is also at the core of the conflict that we see between social media platforms and companies and researchers. Besides my research, I also do consulting for these sad social media platforms, basically discussing how they can make the product and the platform more pro-social and interactive. And in all of these consulting sessions, and I literally mean all the sessions that I've experienced so far, one big elephant in the room is the question how much consumers consume, how much users spend time on the platform. And from their perspective, I get it, the number one currency is user engagement, and they often equate this with the question how much time consumers spend with a product or on a platform. At the same time, I can also understand why researchers are, of course, upset about this, because they've shown for years now that this excessive digital consumption has negative effects. This conflict is, of course, also quite prominent, and it also feeds into this public opinion that digital consumption is outright bad and we should think about how to effectively reduce it. But is this whole discussion maybe a little bit short-sighted? I mean, is it maybe a bit too simple to just think about how much we consume? And should we maybe think way harder about how that is, in which different ways we can consume? Because I bet I can also make you recall instances where you felt refreshed and satisfied afterwards. Basically, instances where you felt as if your consumption has made sense in a way. And interestingly, independent researcher groups just recently pointed to the fact that we should at least distinguish between two different types of consumption. The instances where you feel refreshed afterwards and satisfied are probably the result of what researchers refer to as deliberate or active consumption style. And deliberate consumption refers to all these instances where we consume with a certain goal, with a certain intent in mind. And as a result, we are more aware of our consumption, therefore we are more in control of our consumption. For example, I might go on Instagram and watch certain stories of my friends with a very specific intent to get an update on their lives. I might watch a certain video on TikTok or YouTube with the very specific intent to lift my mood after a hard day at work. Or I might message a colleague on Twitter or a friend on Facebook with the very specific intent to reignite a conversation, because we've just not talked to each other for months. Now, on the other hand, I bet you also recall these instances where you mindlessly swipe through your phone while you wait for the bus or for the train. Here, you basically are not really aware of what you're consuming. At some point, you just clicked on some app and now you're relentlessly scrolling through it in search for some stimulation. Or do you remember the last time where you went to bed, ready to go to sleep, and instead you find yourself scrolling through social media, maybe even for hours? These instances are probably the result of what researchers refer to as passive or automatic consumption style. And it appears that it's this type of consumption that is causing us health problems and dissatisfaction. In fact, when researchers distinguish between these two different types of consumption empirically, they find opposite effects. Passive or automatic consumption was associated with all kinds of decreased well-being and reduced life satisfaction, while in contrast, active or deliberate consumption was associated with increased well-being and a lot of different health benefits. The explanation for this is, and this makes sense, I just talked about this a minute ago, when we intentionally consume, we are more in control of what we are consuming. And therefore, we can really take advantage of the opportunities that we have in the digital space, which are diverse, right? We can acquire new knowledge, we can build social capital with other people, or we can simply but effectively improve our mood. Now, this distinction between two different types of digital consumption can also speak to another debate that we have quite prominently in the public at the moment, which is about what contents to consume online. And based on what I've talked about in the last minutes, my very first response to this would be that the content has to match my intention. A very illustrative example of this is, I think, that if we think about effective or discuss about effective deliberate consumption, this doesn't mean that we cannot have an enjoyable time, that we cannot watch funny stuff anymore. Quite the opposite. Just a minute ago, I talked about automatic consumption and its positive effects, and actually my personal favorite effect is that intentionally consuming something can have very, very positive effects on my mood whenever I need it to be. From time to time, I do a certain exercise every day, which is basically setting aside 1 hour where I consume whatever I want on the internet. And this doesn't mean that I cannot consume any other time of the day. It's basically just meant as a training for myself to learn deliberate consumption, to intentionally sit down and consume whatever I've prepared for myself in this hour. And believe me or not, but at least half of the times, I'm choosing to watch funny videos. And whenever I watch funny videos, I never feel dissatisfied. I feel quite refreshed, indeed. And I never feel as if I've wasted my time just watching funny videos. And I think the reason for this is that in these specific instances, I've made the intentional decision that I need something to lift my mood. And that's what I do by watching funny videos, and it always works perfectly. Now, these exact same videos, that is, this exact same content can of course also appear when I just mindlessly scroll through my phone. Here, I might not even be aware of what I'm consuming. I basically just scroll on whenever a video is over. Here, it's also the case that I consume the exact same content, but it's associated with negative effects. But the important thing to note here is that this is not, in the first place at least, due to the content, but it's about the intentionality with which I'm consuming. Now, in this hour per day, I of course not only watch funny videos, I also use this for other stuff. For example, I just talked about this, I very often use this to get updates on the lives of my friends. Or I use it to message people that I've ignored one too many days. And all of these actions online are totally reasonable and they are acceptable. The important thing is that the content has to match my intention here. Now, deliberate consumption sounds quite simple, but it's actually not that easy to take up. And that's because there are so many instances in our everyday life where we just mindlessly scroll through some app that it's super hard to bring intentionality to all of these instances. And using or setting aside 1 hour per day is one of many methods that you can use, but I also admit that it's a quite effortful one. And so I thought one thing that I can basically present here is a very, very compact and small breathing exercise that you can try to do whenever you're about to open an app. So whenever you are about to open an app, so basically you put out your phone, you click on an app, try to take at least a few seconds to take 2 or 3 deep breaths. What this breathing exercise does is it gives you some time to reflect on what you are about to do. Why did you specifically choose this app? And did you have a very specific intention in mind while choosing this app, or was it just one of these so-called mindless instances? After the breathing exercise, you can do whatever you please. You can basically close the app again and put away your phone, but you can also continue consuming. But even if you do the latter, you will do it with more intentionality. And that's the whole point of the breathing exercise. Now, I also realized that the tricky thing about automatic consumption is that it's to large parts automatic. So it's an unaware process. So very often when we scroll through our phone, we are not really aware of how much we are actually consuming, what we are consuming. And so the last thing that I want to talk about tonight are tools that can help you on your way to more deliberate consumption. And I know this sounds kind of ironic, but the most effective tools that you can use are other digital apps. The market on these apps is exploding at the moment, and so you basically find digital apps for every tiny, teensy step on your way to more deliberate consumption. I mean, there are apps that can help you build very specific habits, like the breathing exercise. There are apps that can help you structure your consumption every day, like setting aside 1 hour to intentionally consume. And there are even apps that can help you reflect on what you are about to do every time you click on an app. The uplifting message for us as the consumers with this technological development is, I think, that we are not alone. Technologists and researchers are becoming more and more aware of how important it is to think about how we engage with the digital space, how we consume online. And they try their best to provide us with tools and insights on our way to a more deliberate consumption style. The number of smartphone users worldwide is estimated at over 5 billion and growing. Almost everybody has a smartphone, and the vast majority of us use it every day. Social media platforms and researchers discuss relentlessly about how much time we should actually spend in the digital space. And the public opinion is very much that digital consumption is generally bad, and we should think about how to effectively reduce it. What I've come to argue tonight is that maybe we should fundamentally change our perspective about digital consumption. And I hope your main takeaway from this talk is that the how is important. How I engage with the digital space, how I consume online. Instead of relentlessly discussing how to consume less, we should think way harder about how to consume different. Thank you for your attention.